There are moments in history when the world changes quietly, not with explosions, not with sirens, not with headlines that scream, crisis, but with an email that says, no. A shipment that doesn't arrive. A supplier who suddenly apologizes and refuses. And by the time the meaning becomes clear, the system has already moved past the point of recovery. This is one of those moments. Right now, something fundamental is breaking inside the global economy. Not tomorrow, not next year. Now. And almost no one is prepared for it. Because this crisis does not look like a financial collapse. It looks like paperwork, licensing requirements, policy adjustments, bureaucratic language hiding a structural shock. But beneath that language lies a reality that will reshape industries, markets, and power itself. Silver is disappearing. Not from the ground, not from the planet, but from the system that made modern life possible. And once you understand why, you will never look at markets or supply chains the same way again. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. Modern economies do not run on money. They run on materials. Money is abstract. Materials are not. You can print currency overnight. You cannot print silver. Every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every solar panel, every data center, every missile guidance system, they all depend on silver. Not as an investment, not as a store of value, but as a physical, irreplaceable input. Silver is not optional. There is no industrial substitute that works at scale without catastrophic loss of efficiency. That is not opinion. That is engineering. For decades, the world treated silver as abundant, plentiful, replaceable, cheap. That belief shaped everything: pricing models, supply chains, financial markets, and most dangerously, complacency. Because while the world focused on oil, semiconductors, and rare earths, silver quietly became one of the most concentrated, fragile supply chains on Earth. To understand what is happening now, we need to dismantle a comforting illusion. The illusion that silver supply is diversified. It is not. Silver mining is global, but silver refining is not. Roughly 2/3 of the world's refined silver passes through a single country. Not because of conspiracy, not because of manipulation, but because of economics. For decades, refining migrated to where costs were lowest, regulations were flexible, and scale was encouraged. Western nations outsourced refining capacity. China absorbed it, slowly, methodically, irreversibly. And the world accepted this trade-off because it worked. Until it didn't. On January 1st, a line was crossed. Not symbolically, operationally. Export licenses were no longer a formality. They became a gate, and the gate closed. What makes this moment historic is not the policy itself. It is the timing. Global inventories are already depleted. COMEX-registered silver is near historic lows. Industrial demand is at record levels. And alternative refining capacity does not exist at scale. This is not a shortage that can be solved by the market, because the market cannot create metal. It can only reveal its absence. And absence is what industrial buyers are discovering right now. Electronics manufacturers, automotive suppliers, energy companies, they are all receiving the same answer. No, not delayed, not renegotiated. No. This is where psychology enters the story. Because markets do not panic when prices rise. They panic when access disappears. Price volatility is tolerable. Supply uncertainty is not. When procurement managers realize they cannot source material at any price, behavior changes instantly. Contracts are abandoned. Backup plans collapse. Emergency calls begin. This is how shortages become crises. Not gradually, simultaneously. And this is where financial markets lag reality. Paper silver trades on screens. Physical silver moves through ports, vaults, factories. When those two realities diverge, pricing becomes fiction. We have seen this before. In the 1970s oil embargo, in wartime commodity rationing, in semiconductor shortages. Each time, the pattern is identical. First, denial. Then, disbelief. Then, panic. And finally, repricing that feels violent only because it was delayed. Silver is entering that phase now, not as an investment narrative, but as an industrial emergency. In the next part, we will go deeper. We will break down why COMEX inventories matter more than price, how paper markets mask physical scarcity, and why this crisis is not temporary, cyclical, or easily reversible. Because once a supply chain collapses at the refining level, recovery is measured in years, not quarters, and the clock has already started. To understand why this moment is so dangerous, we need to separate two realities that most people assume are the same. They are not. The first is the paper market. The second is the physical market. For decades, these two moved closely enough that the difference felt academic. Now they are drifting apart. And when that happens, markets do not correct gently. They snap. The paper-silver market was designed for liquidity, not delivery. Futures contracts were never meant to result in mass physical settlement. They exist to hedge price risk, smooth volatility, and provide price discovery. This system works only under one condition: that physical supply remains abundant enough that delivery is assumed possible, even if rarely demanded. Once that assumption breaks, the entire structure becomes unstable. This is not theory. It is documented history. In 1980, the silver market experienced a delivery crisis triggered by concentrated demand and limited supply. The result was not merely price volatility. It was rule changes, trading halts, forced liquidation. The lesson was clear. When too many participants demand metal instead of cash, the system protects itself, not the claimant. Today's situation is different in cause, but similar in consequence. This time, the pressure is not speculative hoarding. It is industrial necessity. Manufacturers do not want silver because they expect profit. They need it to function. Solar panels cannot be built without it. Electric vehicles cannot scale without it. Advanced electronics cannot operate without it. Defense systems cannot compromise on it. This demand is non-negotiable. And unlike financial demand, it does not disappear when prices rise. It becomes more urgent. Now look at inventories. COMEX registered silver represents metal available for immediate delivery, not total inventory, not theoretical supply, deliverable metal. That number has been declining steadily, Not because demand spiked overnight, but because supply failed to keep pace for years. Mining output plateaued. Ore grades declined. New projects slowed due to permitting, cost inflation, and geopolitical risk. Meanwhile, industrial demand surged. Green energy initiatives accelerated. Electrification expanded. Digital infrastructure exploded. All of this was visible and largely ignored because price did not signal urgency. Paper markets absorbed the stress until they couldn't. Here is where psychology matters. When industrial buyers realize that delivery risk exists, behavior changes instantly. They stop optimizing for price. They optimize for access. They secure long-term contracts. They hoard inventory. They remove metal from circulation. Each of these actions tightens supply further. This creates a feedback loop. Scarcity begets precaution. Precaution begets scarcity. And the paper market does not see this until it is too late. Because futures prices reflect expectations, not availability. This is why physical premiums matter more than spot prices. When premiums rise sharply, it is a signal that the market is lying to itself, that price discovery is failing. We are seeing that now. In parallel, a structural shift is occurring in global trade. Export controls are no longer rare. They are strategic tools. Energy, semiconductors, rare earths, now metals. This is not ideological. It is pragmatic. Nations no longer assume stable globalization. They plan for resilience, which means securing inputs, which means restricting outflows. Once this logic enters policy, it rarely reverses, because supply chains take years to rebuild, and political risk discourages concentration, except where alternatives are absent. Silver refining is one such absence. The capacity does not exist elsewhere at scale. Not today, not next year, not without massive investment and time. This is the core misunderstanding in mainstream commentary. Analysts speak of adjustment, of market response, of new equilibrium. But equilibria require substitutability. Silver does not have it. This is not oil. You cannot switch inputs easily. You cannot redesign products overnight. You cannot pause entire industries while waiting for supply to normalize. This creates urgency that pricing models are not designed to capture. And urgency always outruns paper markets. Now consider the role of major financial institutions. Banks act as intermediaries. They provide liquidity. They facilitate hedging. They assume that physical settlement will remain rare. When that assumption breaks, risk migrates rapidly. Balance sheets strain. Exposure increases. Margins rise. Liquidity tightens. This is not about bankruptcy narratives. It is about systemic stress. When large players adjust positioning simultaneously, volatility spikes, not because the system is failing, but because it is recalibrating under pressure. This is why emergency meetings occur, not to announce collapse, but to contain acceleration. Acceleration is what breaks systems. Gradual change can be absorbed. Sudden repricing cannot. And repricing becomes sudden when reality forces itself into models that excluded it. Now step back. This is not a silver story. Silver is the signal. The underlying story is about material constraint in a financialized world. We built an economy optimized for efficiency, just-in-time supply, minimal inventory, maximum leverage. This works only when inputs are abundant and predictable. Silver is proving that assumption false. And once one critical input breaks the illusion, others follow. The lesson markets are learning, again, is that physical reality always wins, eventually. In the next part, we will examine the second-order consequences. What happens when industries cannot secure inputs? How inflation mutates when it is driven by shortage rather than demand? And why central banks are far less powerful against material constraints than against financial ones. Because you cannot rate cut your way out of missing metal. When scarcity moves from theory into production lines, the economy changes its behavior in ways most people do not immediately recognize. This is where conventional explanations fail. Because inflation caused by excess demand behaves very differently from inflation caused by missing supply. And silver places us firmly in the second category. In demand-driven inflation, higher prices eventually reduce consumption. People delay purchases. Businesses cut back. Credit tightens. The system slows itself. But in supply-driven inflation, especially when the supply is critical, prices rise without reducing demand. Because demand is not optional. A solar manufacturer cannot consume less silver. A defense contractor cannot substitute it. A data center cannot function without it. So instead of slowing, the system reallocates pain. Costs are passed forward. Margins are compressed. Projects are delayed or cancelled. Smaller players exit. This is how scarcity concentrates power, not through conspiracy, through necessity. Large firms secure supply first. They sign long-term contracts, they pay premiums, they build inventory buffers. Smaller firms cannot. They are priced out or timed out. This is not moral. It is mechanical. Over time, industries consolidate. Competition thins. Innovation slows. Not because ideas disappear, but because access does. This is one of the least discussed consequences of material shortages. They do not just raise prices, they reshape market structure. Now zoom out to the macro level. Central banks are trained to fight inflation with tools designed for financial access. Interest rates, liquidity withdrawal, forward guidance. These tools work when inflation is driven by overheating. They are blunt, but effective. They do not work when inflation is driven by physical shortage. Raising rates does not create silver. Quantitative tightening does not refine ore. Verbal assurances do not expand mining capacity. In fact, higher rates often make the problem worse. Mining is capital-intensive. Refining requires investment. New projects depend on financing. When capital costs rise, supply expansion slows. So policy responses aimed at reducing inflation can paradoxically deepen the shortage that caused it. This creates a dilemma. If central banks tighten aggressively, they risk stalling growth without fixing prices. If they remain accommodative, they risk currency erosion. This is not theoretical. We have seen versions of this before. In the 1970s, energy constraints collided with monetary expansion. The result was stagflation. Growth stagnated, prices rose, policy credibility eroded. The difference today is complexity. Modern economies are more interconnected. Supply chains are longer. Dependencies are deeper. And financial markets are vastly larger relative to the physical economy they represent. This amplifies dislocation. A small physical shortfall can trigger outsized financial consequences because leverage magnifies reality. Now return to silver as a case study. Silver sits at the intersection of old and new. It is both a monetary metal and an industrial necessity. It has history. It has utility. It has no replacement. This dual identity makes it uniquely disruptive. When monetary demand rises, price moves. When industrial demand rises, availability vanishes. These forces reinforce each other, and when both activate simultaneously, markets struggle to process the signal. This is why price action alone is misleading. Price is the last thing to adjust. Availability adjusts first, premiums second, delivery times third, production schedules fourth. By the time price reflects scarcity, behavior has already changed. This is why those waiting for confirmation are often late, not because they were careless, but because the system obscured reality. Now consider how this affects confidence. Confidence is not belief. It is expectation based on experience. For decades, markets experienced abundance. Inputs were available. Logistics worked. Globalization smoothed shocks. That experience shaped models, and those models shaped decisions. When experience changes, confidence lags. This lag is where volatility lives. Participants oscillate between old assumptions and new signals. They hesitate. They overreact. They misinterpret noise as trend. This creates instability. Not collapse, instability. And instability changes incentives. Companies prioritize resilience over efficiency. Governments prioritize control over openness. Investors prioritize preservation over growth. Each of these shifts reduces velocity, and reduced velocity feels like slowdown. This is the environment we are entering, not crisis. Transition. Transitions are uncomfortable because they lack narrative clarity. There is no single villain, no single trigger, no single solution. Just accumulation, small constraints adding up, minor frictions compounding, assumptions quietly failing. Silver did not cause this. It revealed it. In the final part, we will step back and ask the most important question. What does this mean for the individual observer? Not the institution, not the policymaker, not the headline, but the person trying to make sense of a system that is changing beneath familiar language, and why understanding structure rather than predicting price is the only durable advantage left. There is a moment in every long economic cycle when the most dangerous mistake is not fear. It is familiarity. Familiarity with language, familiarity with explanations, familiarity with assurances that sound correct because they have always sounded correct. This is that moment. Not because the system is collapsing, but because the system is changing its internal logic. And logic, once changed, does not announce itself loudly. It simply stops responding the way it used to. This is why so many intelligent people feel confused rather than alarmed. Nothing looks broken, yet nothing feels stable. Markets still trade. Institutions still speak. Data still flows. But meaning has thinned. The signals no longer align with the outcomes they once predicted. This is what happens when abstraction drifts too far from material reality. For decades, we lived inside financial representations of the world. Prices, derivatives, indexes, models. They worked because the physical foundation beneath them was stable enough to be ignored. Silver reminds us that this foundation still exists and that it still governs the outcome. You cannot digitize scarcity. You cannot hedge absence. You cannot model your way around missing atoms. At some point, reality re-enters the equation. Not violently, but decisively. The deeper implication of this moment is not about metals, markets, or monetary policy. It is about humility. Modern finance was built on the assumption that complexity could replace constraint, that innovation could substitute for limits, that coordination could override geology. For a long time, it appeared to work, until it didn't. This does not invalidate progress, but it redefines it. Progress without resilience is fragility in disguise, and fragility is always invisible during expansion. It reveals itself only when stress arrives. We are now in a phase where stress is not episodic, it is structural, not high enough to break everything, but persistent enough to expose weaknesses. This is why the language of temporary disruption feels increasingly hollow. Temporary implies reversion. What we are experiencing is adaptation. Adaptation does not restore the past. It constructs a narrower future, one with constraints priced in, one with buffers rebuilt, one with redundancy valued over efficiency. This future will not feel catastrophic, but it will feel slower, more selective, less forgiving of excess. And excess, in this context, includes belief. Belief that markets will always be liquid. Belief that prices always reflect reality. Belief that institutions can smooth every shock. These beliefs were not irrational. They were contextual. They emerged in a world of expanding supply and declining friction. That world is receding. What replaces it is not chaos. It is negotiation. Negotiation with limits, with time, with material reality. This is uncomfortable because it reintroduces trade-offs we forgot existed. Growth versus stability, speed versus security, scale versus control. There are no perfect answers here, only priorities. And priorities shape outcomes more than predictions ever did. For the individual observer, this is both unsettling and empowering. Unsettling because certainty dissolves. Empowering because awareness returns. When narratives weaken, attention sharpens. You begin to notice what others dismiss. You ask different questions. You resist easy conclusions. This is not about timing markets or forecasting prices. It is about orientation, understanding what kind of system you are inside, and how that system behaves under constraint. Orientation does not demand action, it demands patience. Patience to watch structures, not headlines, to track incentives, not promises. To distinguish between volatility and transformation. Most people confuse the two. They react to movement. They miss direction. Direction reveals itself only over time. This is why restraint is underrated. In a culture obsessed with decisiveness, restraint appears passive. It is not. It is selective engagement. It is the refusal to be emotionally conscripted by narratives designed to simplify complexity. It is the discipline to remain present while others rush to conclusions. This discipline does not eliminate risk. Nothing does. But it aligns risk with understanding. And understanding is the only edge that compounds. As we close, consider this. The most consequential shifts in history were not recognized when they began. They were rationalized, minimized, explained away. Only later were they named. We may not yet have a name for this moment, but its outline is becoming visible. A world relearning limits, a system repricing certainty, an economy negotiating with matter. Silver is not the story. It is the reminder. If this reflection resonated with you, treat it not as instruction, but as invitation. An invitation to think more slowly, to question more deeply, to discuss rather than declare. A thoughtful comment is not noise. It is evidence of engagement. Sharing this with someone whose judgment you respect is not promotion. It is intellectual courtesy. And subscribing is not commitment. It is simply a signal that you value depth over reassurance. This channel exists for those who prefer understanding to comfort, structure to slogans, and long thinking to short certainty. Thank you for staying to the end. Not because you watched, but because you thought.